I've tried to explain troublesome terps to people who haven't heard of it before, and I've been explaining it as Monty Python Goes Interpreting.
Yay!
Alex, you are humming.
I know, I'm not trying to be Donald Trump here. I just had really spicy noodles.
You know what? Yeah, not nice.
And I'm gonna dance!
Wow, can we do that?
The first 20 minutes of every conference in Scotland is going to be haggis, whiskey, and kilts.
Hello, and welcome to Troublesome Terps, a Pros Community Choice Awards nominated podcast by interpreters, for interpreters, with humour that only interpreters will find funny, hopefully. I am Alexander Drexel, the interpreter who, according to some at least, knows more about tablets than Moses. We'll see about that. With me here today is another Alexander, Herr Gansmeyer, who knows more about the Oktoberfest than he cares to admit or remember. Alex, how are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing sehr gut.
Sehr gut. Wonderful. And that was more French. Anyway, and lastly, the only one of us who looks fetching in a fuchsia gown, who knows more about stuff you've never heard of than anyone else, Dr. Jonathan Downey. He's also the only one here who knows how to pronounce fuchsia correctly. Was that the correct Glaswegian pronunciation there, Jonathan?
That was correct, but it's also the only colour in the English language which Google can't actually decide how to spell. So if you little tip, if you Google fuchsia, it will say did you mean and give you another spelling, and if you click on that spelling, it will say did you mean and give you the spelling that you put in first.
Wow.
So
that's deep.
Hilariously weird. The English language is odd.
Yeah, it's full of wonders and miracles. But we're not talking about colours or gowns or anything today. Our topic is conferences, but not the ones where we sit in a glass booth and we interpret, but conferences that we attend as participants. So we wanted to recap a few of our recent experiences. Jonathan has been to a few conferences lately, and the two Alexes as well. And Jonathan, why don't you start us off with one of your recent conference experiences? Which was the one that still stands out the most to you?
Well, the one that will stand in my memory for a while was a couple of weeks ago. I was in sunny Aarhus in Denmark for the EST conference. Now, this is where I diverge from a lot of interpreters in that I'm insane enough to go to academic conferences and professional ones. But it's interesting because most of the debates in the academic conferences on interpreting are very, very relevant to our work. EST conference will stand out for quite a few reasons. The first being that I got voted onto the EST executive board by a single vote.
Wow.
Yes,
Congratulations. That
was exciting and nerve-wracking. The second thing that stands out in my mind is that suddenly I was watching a researcher talk about statistics. Now, it's not usually the most exciting subject and not usually one I understand. And so, for instance, they have looked at the analysis and found that interpreters do have more effective working memories than non-interpreters, and they've looked at that over something like 24 different studies, and it's the first statistically consistent result they have found. So interpreting is beginning to establish itself as an academic field, which is good for the profession, and I think it's it's giving us this basis that we can now tell people not only is interpreting worth doing, it's worth doing well, and it's worth being honoured with the same honour that we would give medicine or law or any of these established professions, that we're now getting that level of study. So that really stood out to me, that interpreting is here, it's here to stay, and we're beginning to show that we're as valid a field of study and work as any other established profession.
So maybe to just back up for a second. So EST stands for European Society of Translation Studies, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, which covers written translation, interpreting, audiovisual translation, basically anything to do with translation and or interpreting.
So on the spectrum of academic and professional conferences, the EST one would be one of the academic conferences?
It's probably the top academic conference in Europe, and it only happens every 3 years. And literally, if there's something to do with translation or anything that looks like translation, you will find it at EST conference. And one other thing, we had a researcher who's an expert on translation technology who pointed out that no serious machine translation researcher thinks it will ever replace humans.
That's comforting to know.
It's basically because they're working on neural machine translation, which there's some evidence for and some not. But basically the deal is that almost all machine translation researchers now see it as either for language combinations where human translation or interpreting is uneconomical, or for situations where it can support humans. And that's simply because language does things that even a neural network isn't as good at doing as we are.
Yeah.
And so all this stuff about, earbuds in your ears and, Google taking over, it's nonsense. And the serious researchers, the people who are doing actual science on it, will tell you that. The marketing people won't.
Of course they won't. So in terms of audience, it's academics, but also people from the technology industry, it sounds like.
Well, she kind of sits between the two, that researcher, but you have academics, you have practicing professionals there. So we had the head of the FIT, which is the International Federation of Translation, which covers all the associations. There's now more of a crossover, and I would plead with professionals to go to at least one academic conference every couple of years. If only because there's nowhere better to get the myths that we might have in our heads busted. And also you'd be surprised at the very practical things you can learn at an academic conference. So target, if you're in an interpreter, target something like Critical Link or an interpreting conference if you're a translator. Go to one on the practical side of translation rather than literary translation and philosophy. But you will find things that you can take back to your own work and actually think differently and do it better. So we might get to that later, kind of talking about deliberate practice and what does it mean to become an expert interpreter. That's things that researchers are looking at that I think professionals should really care about as well.
That's right. You're saying that there's a benefit to attending these quote-unquote academic conferences, not just go to the quote-unquote practical conferences where you learn about marketing and the latest translation software and, getting freelance clients and that kind of thing.
What happens is if you go to an academic conference, you will never see a professional conference the same way. Just to get inside an academic's head for 5 minutes, you'll go to a professional conference and ask questions like, okay, that's this one person's experience. Is that generalizable to everyone? Or, this is what this one person did to improve, or the tool this one person finds useful. Is that going to apply to me? Mm-hmm. And there are some professional conferences that are very good at having generalizable material. There are other conferences where I've been disappointed with some of the speakers at the professional conferences because they've said things, and as an academic, I know that only applies in certain cases, or it only applies to a certain kind of person. And so once you've been to an academic conference and you've learned the rigor that academics have to think with, when you go to a professional conference, you find it easier to pick out the stuff that will be useful, and you're less likely to be fooled with flashy demos.
Good point. So in terms of audience, was it very academic at the EST conference, or were there people from, practitioners, if you will?
Well, the two overlap. A lot of academics are practitioners. It was mostly academics, but as I said, you had Henry Liu from FIT there. And I think actually the way things are going, the academics are going to need more practitioners to be around and to be interested. That's a whole other debate. But I think Henry was there, and I think there were a few other pure practitioners, but it was out of the 400, I think probably 350 or 360 would have been pure academics, going from PhD students all the way up to senior professors. And that makes makes any session a very, very interesting one to be. And I was co-chairing a session, got up to speak in the second session of the panel, and realised that one of the world's expert on translation theory was sitting 2 rows in front of me. And suddenly that changes the game when you know that the person who invented the theory that you did your PhD on is sitting in the room. It ups the ante a bit, but I think that's good because you don't want to be speaking when people are just going to be swallowing it and not thinking. Yeah.
So we can talk a little bit about the networking aspect of conferences later on, but I wanted to talk to Alex as well. He told us before we started the episode, actually, that he doesn't attend a lot of conferences, but some he does. So maybe tell us a little bit about a conference that you attended recently, or one that you really have in very good memory, let's say.
Yeah, sure. Funnily enough, for me, it's a little bit of the opposite of what Jonathan just said, because I usually don't tend to go to academic conferences because I just find that I don't have the attention span required. So I usually go to very practical conferences where it's, where I can immediately relate it to my professional life and what that means for me. How can I implement it? Because that kind of captures my attention a little longer. I went to, and Alex, you were there as well, the Interpreters for Interpreters Well, I guess it's a workshop. I don't think it's really a conference.
Yeah, it's a very small one. Yeah, it's a very small event.
Yeah, it's very small. I think it's about 50, 60 people maybe. And it's always hosted annually in the German region of AIG. And they do, well, yeah, as the name says, it's interpreters for interpreters. So it's really practicing interpreters, giving and hosting sessions for other interpreters. And it's always one speaker at a time. Um, I had the fortune and the privilege to speak there twice, and I always found it very fun for my side. Of course, incredibly nerve-wracking because you feel like every single slip of the tongue, or everything you say, people are going to judge you to the harshest degree they can. But I think so far I've done okay. No one's
Yeah.
crucified me, so that's pretty good. And yeah, I always found that it was very interesting to hear what other people had to say.
I still remember the one we attended together, the Interpreters for Interpreters workshop. There was a pretty cool demo by Leonie Wagner and Anja Rütten because they have,
Yeah.
kind of a joint project which is about collaborating on terminology in a Google spreadsheet.
Yes.
And yeah, why didn't you tell us a little bit about how that went, Alex?
I think that particular presentation went pretty well because it was about, I thought it was really interesting too, because it was about basically real-time glossary work in the booth. So while one person is interpreting, they can give each other notes via Google Sheets because obviously you can see it in real time, and then they can also collaborate on the glossary ahead of the conference. And a funny little thing, and I've actually done that recently on a job that I had in Madrid with my booth mate. You have the little chat window, and it's funny how such a little chat window can make you feel that much less alone when you're doing really monotonous preparation work. So that was pretty, just kind of like a little psychological thing. But yeah, I think the Interpreters for Interpreters workshop is quite phenomenal every single year, and it's very hands-on. So I think, was it last time, Alex? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think last time we did a couple of, I wouldn't call them yoga exercises, but like exercises you can do in the booth just because we sit all day.
Yeah, I think that's been part of every IFI so far. There's a colleague of ours from the German market, Conrado Portugal, I think his name is. And I don't know if he's an actual yoga teacher, but he's certainly very experienced with yoga exercises and breathing techniques. So usually he would usually do the last session of the day to calm everyone down and to give these yoga stretches and breathing exercises, which is great. It's really awesome. And then the great thing also about this last edition of the IFI, I think it was in July in Berlin, July this year, there were people from related industries, if you will, or from related professions. So we had a sign language interpreter. We had people who do subtitling, all these professions that are somehow related to interpreting. And it was just extremely interesting to get an insight into their work. So I really appreciated that.
Yeah. I was a little miffed I couldn't go to that one, but I had other...
Yeah, you missed out.
Yeah, I know I missed out. I had other prior appointments. And I think that brings me back to the networking part that you already mentioned as well. I think it's always really good if you go to these... and I don't want to take away from the academic conferences because I have almost no experience with them. So Jonathan, please, again, correct me if I'm wrong on this. But I think with the practical conferences, one of the big benefits is that you have a tremendous networking opportunity there, be it at the conference, in the coffee breaks, or even when you're having dinner or drinks later after the conference. It's just really great to see so many practicing colleagues all in one spot and getting to mix and mingle with them. So I think that's one of the big draws for me about practical conferences with practicing professionals. I don't know how it is with the academic world.
It's slightly different in the academic world, although a lot of them are practicing professionals themselves, so you still get that networking thing.
Yeah.
The academics network for a slightly different reason, but I think one of the ways that I judge a conference, and this might sound very odd, but I judge a conference by its atmosphere. And so, for instance, TLC conference, which is every March in Warsaw, is a conference that I will always be happy to attend because it's the friendliest conference I've ever been to. And I know the networking there is so relaxed and chilled out that, it just works. And they've managed to set the conference up really, really well. And the meals up really, really well that you just feel like you're going to chat to someone. Even if you don't know them, the number of times I've sat down at a table and known maybe one person at the table, and within 5 minutes, there might be a table of 8 people and you're all chatting away and getting to know each other. I've not done a huge amount of work out of networking at conferences, but I have learned a lot of what I would call market intelligence, which I think is quite rare, certainly outside the big conference cities in interpreting, to be able to understand how the markets are working in different countries. And also to share, if you see a fairly local colleague, to be able to share, what's going on with you, what's happening. Interpreting is a strange business in that we work in teams, but outside of the big conference cities, we tend not even to know a lot about our own markets, never mind the one 50 miles or 500 miles down the road. To be able to understand what's happening in someone else's market is actually really, really important, because few of our clients only operate in one city. They're not going to be, I only have events in Edinburgh. They're going to have events all over. And if you can learn what is going on elsewhere, it can actually give you tips for dealing with your clients at home. But yeah, I would say that when it comes to the business networking side of traditional conferences, have that completely knocked out. I would say that I would like conferences to give a little bit more time to networking. We tend to squish so many sessions.
Yeah.
And actually, if you ask people why do they go to a conference, most people will say, they will say they want to hear something, but they will often say, I want to meet new people. And it'd be nice to make just a little bit, maybe kill a couple of sessions a day, just to meet new people, or have sessions where instead of being taught something, you're doing a workshop and getting to know people. I try to not do talks anymore. I try to do workshops, and some of the stuff I do in workshops, you get to know other translators and interpreters because I make you do it.
It's actually funny.
So a few free tips for conference organizers in there. Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention the whole networking bit, because I remember when I was living in Manchester, and together with a colleague from the UK, I organized the first tweet up in Manchester for the Northwest Translators Network. And it was all supposed to be about, Twitter, how you can use it professionally, but also, of course, networking. And at the end of the day, that's what social media is kind of good for as well, reaching out to other people and connecting. So in a way, again, networking. So we said that we would give a little bit of a presentation as to how you can set up your Twitter account, really take it from scratch, and how you set it up, how you use it. And then after that, of course, we wanted to, network. So we did a couple of speed dating exercises with the people, and it was really fun, and everybody really enjoyed it, because with that, you got to know a lot of people, and you were forced to, just because that was the whole point of the exercise. So we really had, I think it was about 4, 5, 6 different activities, and yeah, we basically ran through all of them, I think. Maybe not all of them, but almost all of them, because at the end, everybody was talking, and that's kind of the point. I mean, in the beginning of, I think of every conference, at least that's how I do it, you always run towards the people and you're like, oh my God, it's so amazing to see you here, how have you been, and so on and so forth. And you're kind of stuck with that group, probably, unless you guys go for different sessions, because that's just the people you like them, you like hanging out with them. Maybe you don't get to work with them so often, so you just kind of take that opportunity. And by having these different, I'm just going to call them speed dating exercises, we force people to break up their usual pairings and get to know other people. So that was really cool, and I think that worked tremendously well.
Oh, on that subject, some interpreters in Edinburgh getting together, and we were looking at going for a meal and stuff, and I just said, well, why don't we just go all 10-pin bowling? So in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to have our very first Edinburgh interpreters meet up, and we're going 10-pin bowling.
That is really cool.
Which is going to be absolutely hilarious. Because, my average 10-pin bowling score for an entire session, if I get into double figures, I'm quite happy. I'm the only adult I know who asked them to put the lane buddies up so the ball can't actually go in the gutter. So it's going to be absolutely hilarious. But sometimes we need to do stuff that's different. And I think, free tip to conference organizers, some of the most amazing moments at things like ITI conference for me haven't been the big meals and stuff, but have been like, being around the singing translators. To have something that's unusual. That people don't normally do.
Yeah.
I think sometimes the stuff that everyone's slightly, don't do this every day. When everyone's in that situation, it's more comfortable. Whereas when you have a big gala meal and everyone's thinking, is this black tie, white tie, black jeans, white jeans, what am I supposed to do here? Those meals are really, really nice, but you always end up talking business when you're having canapes and crepe.
Yeah.
When you're at the 10-pin bowling alley, you're not going to be talking business. It's not going to happen.
No, that's true.
No, and I know of similar events, for example, in the German professional associations who organize the social events. Some of them go hiking or some of them do other activities. And I think it's really fun because it takes you out of the traditional settings. And as you said, Jonathan, it's just you have different topics. It's a different atmosphere. And I think that's really, really relaxing. And that brings me to a somewhat related questions. The difference between these smaller workshops, smaller events, tweet-ups, pub nights, maybe, versus the big conferences, because I have attended maybe one or two of the very big conferences, like the FIT Congress in 2014 in Berlin, which was huge, with I believe 4 or 5 tracks at the same time.
That was amazing.
And I had a great time because you see so many people because they come from all over the world for these big events. But on the other side, I find that sometimes there are so many sessions going on at the same time that you don't know what to pick, and then you don't have enough time for that and don't have enough time for this, and I find it very stressful. So I was wondering what your take is on the small versus big.
Can I be honest with you? As a speaker, my experience has been that I find it easier to speak to a big room. But if you do the same material, like there's one session that I did to a room full of about 80 people. And then I did it in Edinburgh to 6 people, which really didn't work. And then I did it to 22 in London. And I realised when you get people in a small room close enough together that they're almost rubbing shoulders all the time, you often get better work because no one can hide. As an attendee, I like the big conferences because I have more options. It's less obvious if I'm finding everything on every track boring, I can hide more easily. But I think if I'm there to learn, I would rather go to a small event. If I'm there to network, I would rather go to a big event.
What about you, Alex?
I was just listening to what Jonathan said, and it makes sense, but I quite frankly haven't really put too much thought into it because I don't know. I think it both has its perks. As a speaker, I definitely find it more comfortable to speak to a smaller room.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think when you go to a big conference, you do have more opportunities to network. But if you go to a smaller conference, you're kind of networking automatically because you're in the room with like a handful or maybe handful of people. But of course, Jonathan's right again. If you're at a smaller conference with only one track and the presentation you're looking at is boring, which has happened to me in the past, then, there's kind of no escape. And there's only so many times you can excuse yourself to the bathroom before you look like a weirdo. So I don't know. I haven't really put too much thought into that. I think it both has its pros and cons. And I wouldn't really only want to go to one, but only go to the other either. So what's your take, Alex?
Well, as I said, I think... they both have their pros and cons, but I think I have a slight preference for the smaller events, both as an attendee and as a speaker. I think it's more intimate. You have a more direct contact as a speaker with the people you're talking to, or if you're holding a workshop, obviously you'll want a smaller group because you get much better results. And I think the bigger conferences have the advantage that they usually attract more people from further away, which is nice because you see them less often. But then again, you have so much going on that it's just extremely exhausting. It's great, but it's exhausting.
Yeah.
So, for example, I'll be attending the ATA conference this autumn for the first time, which I think is the biggest of its kind. And of course, I'm looking forward to it, but I think I will be pretty exhausted when I come back. And not because of the jet lag.
Take some days off to recover.
So I was just curious about that. But yeah, Jonathan?
I was going to say, I think the thing is, as interpreters, we end up having to be conference experts anyway, because, as conference interpreters, we have to understand how they tick. And one of the things that I've noticed as an interpreter, which I try not to do as a speaker, is a lot of speakers try to put the knowledge first and the relationship second. So we've all interpreted the speaker who, the guy, the man or lady is incredibly intelligent, and they've got so much information to share, but they try to pack 3 hours worth of information into 30 minutes, which never ever works. On the other hand, the speaker who gets people laughing and gets people involved and shares 10 minutes of content in half an hour is actually doing a better job. And I think that's kind of one of the things that I notice about conferences is I can notice the speakers who are confident enough that don't feel they have to tell you everything in one session are the speakers who do best. And the speakers who I really love are the ones who are happy to laugh and joke and they've got something interesting to share, but they'll connect with you and then they'll share, rather than sharing the info and expecting you to have a notepad and write everything down. It's amazing when you're the other side of the booth how much you learn for your speaking, that you go, actually, connect first, then deliver the information in a way that works, then check it's there. That sort it. But as just milling about, I remember when I started my career, I used to try and avoid the clients just in case they asked me to interpret over lunch. And now I actually realise that as an interpreter, when you're interpreting at an event, I know it's different if you're a staffer, but as a freelancer, it's incredibly useful to network with the people that you're interpreting for. Not necessarily giving out your business card, because we know that's problematic, but even just talking to them about their work. See, when you go into the next session, so much easier to interpret.
But can I just ask about clarification on the terminology? Because we're saying conferences and then workshops. So are we equating one with the other? Because I was wondering this on the, throughout the run up on this podcast taping, and they're obviously different workshops. So actual proper CPD events where you book, I don't know, a social media marketing strategy workshop, or if you go to the Fleet Congress, those are kind of the two opposite sides on that particular spectrum. But they are, of course, very similar, and I think that the lines are kind of blurry in some ways. Like, for example, with the AIC Interpreters for Interpreters event, it's not really a workshop, but it's also not a conference. It's kind of a hybrid between the two. So what do you guys think? Because I think I've been to a bunch of workshops that I wouldn't classify as conferences that I thought were better than many bigger conferences, both in terms of the networking and in terms of my takeaway of the information.
Well, I think that the blurring a little bit, I think it's becoming a little more difficult to differentiate between these various kinds of events, and I think that's okay. So, for example, we have these new or relatively new formats popping up, like the Tweet Up you mentioned earlier, Alexander, or the, as you said, the Interpreters for Interpreters workshop, which is in fact a mini conference, because it's a bunch of several workshops, each following each other. So it's like a small one-track conference. But I think it's nice that they sort of converge, and when the big conference is just about people standing in front of a big room and talking about a topic, but when they also have workshops and more interactive elements. So I think that's fine. And I wanted to maybe just very quickly touch on a very different format, which I hadn't heard of before, but which I did last week. So PROS held an online conference on the 30th of September, which is International Translation Day, which was a very interesting format to me. So it was basically a website full of webinars and video workshops on all kinds of different topics, from marketing to technology and what have you. And I thought that was a very interesting format. And the talks are also available on demand afterwards. There's a chat room that you can have. There's a Q&A afterwards. So I don't know if you've ever attended anything like that, but I thought it was a very interesting idea, and huge participation as far as I can tell.
I went to one, I think it was either last year or the year before I went to one, and I found, I'll be honest, and I will say, I found the PROS online conference bewildering, because certainly the year I did it, they tried to make it as much like a conference as possible. So they actually had like stands and they had different rooms and stuff.
Yeah.
And in a way I could understand what they were doing, but in a way it represented to me a trend that I'm concerned about, and that is the dehumanization of knowledge, to use a kind of academic sounding term. And that is that we seem to become very, very happy with this idea of the knowledge is more important than the person delivering it. So if you think with webinars, you never ever meet the trainer. You hear this disembodied voice. You occasionally get to throw a question, but it's basically throwing knowledge at you. And it's almost like a spoken word book, an audio book. And I can see the use for them, but I think for me, the difference between a conference and a workshop is, in a workshop, the audience should be doing the work and the speaker should be able to go to the shop. That's my silly definition of a workshop. But the difference for me is that in a workshop, I would expect that 80 to 90% of the time, the people attending would be physically doing something that's improving their skills. At conferences, I would expect that the people there would be more likely to be writing notes. The lines are blurring between the two, and you get conferences that have workshops. I tend to tell conference organisers if I'm speaking that I prefer to give something towards a workshop than just a talk, because I've found them more effective learning strategies. But it's a strange question. I just actually wanted to congratulate interpreters, obviously, in Germany and in Brussels, for being able to attract people to those CPD events. In the UK, we've not had that record of doing it well. Certainly amongst conference interpreters, we've really struggled. And I think, the one takeaway that I'd like people to take away from this show is it's actually worth telling, for 1 or 2 days a year or 3 or 4 times a year, just saying to clients, even if you want me for an event, I'm already booked up that day. And do the CPD. It won't destroy your bottom line. In fact, that actually might improve your turnover. You're not going to lose the client by saying no once. In fact, you might impress them by saying, I'm away to do training. I would like to see more interpreters commit to doing CPD and commit to doing something that's going to take them out of the house to meet other interpreters and do CPD. And obviously, IEC in Germany and in Brussels are doing amazingly at it. I think some of the less mature markets could be doing with learning from what you guys have managed.
Just to come back to the online conference, I mean, I think I get your point, but I think I beg to differ. I mean, I've only done it once, obviously, but I think it's really up to the host of the webinar to make it, human, if you will. Because of course, I mean, technically the easiest thing is to just record your slides and then do a voiceover and throw it in there. But my co-host and I, we went to great effort, to make it personal, to have our own faces in there, to make it personal, and also to be available in person for the Q&A afterwards. But certainly depends on the topic and also on how the individual host would design it. And I'm also, of course, I'm not saying that we only should do these online conferences now and should do away with the real life conferences. That's certainly not the point. Lastly, I wanted to touch on a related question, which is that we should not only attend our own conferences, i.e. conferences on interpreting and translation, but that we should also take a look at events that are organized by our clients, so that we should go to specialized trade shows, let's say. And I believe, Jonathan, you went to exactly one of these events not too long ago.
Yeah, every June I go to a trade show for the events industry in London. I'm actually going to up it to 2, maybe 3 a year. And I do it for a couple of reasons. One is that every time I go there, if I don't get clients, which I did this time, I got on the preferred supplier list of a client I'd been chasing for a while, I get knowledge of what is going on in their world. And that makes it so much easier to have conversations when you know what they're talking about. The meeting show in London, I think they have about 400 different stalls. They have thousands of people going. It's only over 2 days, so I just go one day. They have a seminar program. I shouldn't have gone to the Brexit seminar this year because it just depressed me. But just walking around, and sometimes the mistake I made the first year was only going to the stalls that I thought would be potential clients. That's always a mistake. You want to go to all the stalls and to lots of different stalls and just talk to people about their work. So this year I went up to some stalls. Apparently PAs and secretaries are being asked to run more events. And there were a few magazines for PAs and secretaries there because of that. And I went up to them and said, I see you're editing this magazine. Do you ever struggle for getting good quality content? And both of the editors smiled massively at me and said, yes, why do you ask? And so in 2 secretary magazines, I've got 2 2-page articles, which are essentially telling people about interpreting, but have my name and website on it. So for me, it's the equivalent of free advertising. And it is those kind of opportunities that you get at client conferences that you don't get at our conferences. The chance to write for the magazines that they read, the chance to meet them in person. And I met one lady who was Bulgarian, who as soon as she heard I was an interpreter asked what my languages were. I told her that I spoke French, and she immediately switched into perfect French. And suddenly you go, okay, this is a new world for me. What's going on? And I found out that she knew a whole lot about languages, knew a whole lot about the problem with interpreters, and she was able to tell me exactly what her company were looking for in interpreters. I thought, well, where else could I have learned that? So those events are absolutely invaluable for not just selling, because it's hard to sell at those events, but for doing your reconnaissance and finding out what's actually going on in someone else's world.
Excellent. Alex, do you have any experience in that regard? Done anything like that in the past?
Nope.
Okay.
No, to elaborate on that a little bit, I thought about it, and I actually downloaded a bunch of calendars for the Munich Trade Fair, which trade fair is on, so what do they do? And I actually wanted to go to the IT specialized ones, because that's kind of my favorite thing. But I just never made it. I've thought about it. I wanted to go, and either they are ridiculously expensive or I can't go. So, yeah. I think in theory it's a great idea. I just can't go. And before I wanted to say something on the whole CPD attendance thing, and I think subconsciously that's one of the reasons why when I go to CPD I oftentimes go as a speaker, because if I go as a speaker I have to go. There's no other way. Whereas if I go as a participant and I get a good job, I'm just like, well, I'll obviously take the job and
good point.
Take the hit on the money that I already spent on the flight or the hotel or whatever. Yeah, I just kind of force myself to go to these things by being a speaker, because then you can't really back out. And that's the way that I've done it at the ITI conference or the Interpreters for Interpreters, or wherever. If you're involved in the conference, you have to kind of go because you're involved in the conference.
I really like that.
So
that's great. Okay.
No, but it's true. But because I talked about this with a friend of mine, and it's really hard for us interpreters to go to events, because when you do have that last minute job that comes in, you usually just kind of throw everything you've planned overboard, and you just kind of go for the job. And that's why I think it's very hard oftentimes to plan for big or bigger interpreting workshops and conferences successfully, because our job can be very last minute. Like, for example, right now, today's Monday evening, I'm still waiting for confirmation on a job this Thursday. I don't know if it's happening or not. So it's a little tricky at times.
Yeah. Good strategy, though. I really like that. Okay.
You just got to know how to deal with yourself.
Yeah, exactly. So to wrap things up, what's up on the calendar? What's in the future? Do you have any conferences lined up that you're looking forward to attending or organizing? Hint, hint.
Well, this weekend, I'm going to stop you doing your shameless promotion first. This weekend, I'm off to Utrecht to speak at the... I knew what you guys were doing. See, I'm the king of shameless plugs myself. I haven't even mentioned the book. Anyway, this weekend I'm off to Utrecht for the...
What book? You wrote the book? What?
Book? What book? I'm off to Utrecht to speak at the 60th anniversary of the Dutch Translation and Interpreting Association. And that's going to be really good. It's a one-day conference. It's kind of like a half-day conference, but it goes on late. The lineup of speakers looks really, really good. A lot of people who I've heard of, but not heard. And I love this idea of giving back, of being at other events, seeing what other people do. And also, this is a kind of personal thing. When I have time at conferences, I like to try and visit places. So in Prague, with BP16 this year, I managed to arrive early enough that we went on a little tour of Prague, which was quite nice with some colleagues. This year, I grew up as a huge fan of a lady called Corrie ten Boom, who's a Dutch lady whose family saved thousands of Jews during the Second World War. And her house and their family's watch shop is still there in the Netherlands. So I'm going to go there in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I'm going to be afternoon and evening. I'll be at the conference, and I think actually sometimes we've talked about learning from people from different professions. I think sometimes it does us good to learn about people or events that have nothing to do with interpreting, that have nothing to do with professional work, but that speak to something deeper than I've got to get a client, I've got to learn how to use this software. I think that does. It makes me feel a bit more human when I've done something more than go to a city, seen the conference, I'll go back home. People joke about, as an interpreter and speaker, you must see the world. And I've said, yeah, I've seen more hotels every year than I care to mention. What else do you see? But to be able to see something else and go, there's more to this city than a hotel room. I think it is really, really worthwhile.
Great points. Yeah. So this autumn, I'm looking forward to attending the ATA conference for the first time. It's going to be very exciting, I guess. And also get to do 2 talks, one with Holly Bill. And what about you, Alex? I think you have a very nice event coming up in November.
Well, technically, we have a very nice event coming up in November. And here's where the shameless plug comes in, because the both Alexes and a fantastic team of other interpreters in Germany have organized a bar camp, which comes back to the very new and novel ways of doing these kinds of conferences, or CPD in general. And the bar camp has nothing to do with cocktails, as I initially thought, which
cocktails optional.
is a little bit of a shame, but you know. But it is actually a very new way of doing CPD in that there is no agenda. So you sign up for the conference, for a 2-day conference, and at the beginning of the first day, everybody meets up, everybody kind of mingles and introduces themselves, and then everybody suggests a topic that they would like to present. There is no mere audience, everybody's an actual participant, so everybody's actually a presenter or an active part of the conference in one way or the other. So if you don't want to present something, if you don't want to be a speaker for a workshop slot, you can also help out during the coffee break, or you can write a blog article about the conference, or you can do whatever you want. You just can't be a passive bystander throughout the conference. So in the beginning of the first day, everybody suggests something that they could do, and then you kind of piece together the 2-day agenda on the fly. And yeah, that's kind of the whole concept, which I thought was very cool. It was suggested by Sonja Willner, a colleague from Germany, and yeah, it was really cool. So it's what we've put up together, and this is taking place in Munich in a co-working space, in my co-working space, kind of, on November 19th and 20th. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be in attendance because I have a job, so I had to throw everything overboard, like I said. So yeah, the boons and banes. But it's a really cool event, and Alex, I'm pretty sure we're going to be linking to that in the description to today's podcast.
Absolutely. So your strategy didn't quite work out in that case, because
I know.
you won't be there, but that's okay.
9 times out of 10.
Exactly. Well, we're looking forward to welcome a lot of other very cool colleagues. I'm really looking forward to that event as well. So as you said, Alex, we'll put all the relevant links into the show notes. The quickest way to find us online is to just go to troubleterps.com. You'll find links to our podcast, to the Tumblr that we have, where we share funny pictures and stuff about interpreting. And we wrap it up for today's episode. Talk to you soon here on the Troublesome Terps. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
An hour of that is absolutely no problem at all.